Hello, Kevin. How are you?
Fine, Finn. How are you doing today?
Fine, thanks. So I thought we were gonna go to the second part of that very interesting article that you wrote a couple of weeks ago called "The Great Conflation," which we all can find on Substack. A couple of weeks ago, we did the first part of this video where we discussed the chosen few, right? The concept of the chosen people, which is, of course, very important in the Hebrew, but also in the American historiography or in culture. And now we're going to go to the second part, which I think is extremely interesting from a, let's say, history of religion point of view, where you are describing the Hebrew gods. And we can go directly to the section of the article called The Case of the Missing Hebrew Gods. I think here you really did an excellent job of digging out information. I guess you can explain where all this information comes from, which sources. I think it's very interesting to also discuss about that. So please go ahead, and I'll just share the article here.
Okay. It's important. The precision is the case of the missing Canaanite gods, and only one of those gods was actually Hebrew. And so the old order. So let's talk about sources first. Since in the 20th century, there were several archaeological finds and also the Dead Sea Scrolls that gave us a different interpretation of the Bible. They were older translations that were, let's say, less monotheistic. And so there's two schools of thought, basically. Um, it, it, in regard, obviously, there's others, but the two main schools are like strict Moses monotheism. In other words, those are the believers, the people who believe in the Bible, Orthodox Jews and Christians believe a certain thing that Moses imposed monotheism. The people did resisted it and were bad and evil, and God had to punish them enough so that they became good monotheists. Whereas the Canaanite pantheon theorists see a much more gradual transition from like a primal polytheism and into a slow merging or conflation into a single God, which was Yahweh. And now both sides could argue with each other forever. There's nothing's definitive or 100% in this. It's nuance everywhere. But I'm just basically arguing the Canaanite convergence model. Uh, and some of the sources, there's some great YouTube channels that are full of nuance and very careful in what they say. They're very big scholarly stations like Let's Talk Religion, Religion for Breakfast, and Esoterica. Those are the three sources, and from there they recommend different books. So I read a number of books on the conflation of El and Yahweh. But what I'd like to first say, even the most original source in my mind was this amazing book, Moses and Monotheism by Sigmund Freud, which really, I read it maybe 2 years ago. I've always been interested in the primal father theory. And so he explains it there, but he does it in a very interesting way. Uh, he basically, it was a controversial book, and he was writing it in the late 30s, as obviously Jews were under a lot of pressure in Europe, he understood, everyone understood a catastrophe was on its way. And he wanted to understand why the Jews were so hated. And so he kind of psychoanalyzed Jews as a people. And he came up with a kind of a primal father theory that Moses was an Egyptian. He broke away and took the Hebrews and made pushed monotheism on him. They resisted it and killed him. They subsumed guilt for a long time, and in order to relieve the guilt, eventually Judaism, many millennium later, arose. And so that's the source of the ideas from this in this article.
Interesting. But before you go any further, may I just ask here, because there are two of these gods that we have been speaking about very frequently in the public conversation, not least related to a lot of public events. but also related to the genocide in Gaza. The first one I'm thinking about is the one you mentioned here, Baal, right? And we see a lot of iconography related to Baal, this demon. And I'm just wondering if you have some idea or some thoughts around the reason why Baal is so frequently mentioned in the West today. This kind of satanistic streak that is ongoing right now.
In
And the second one is basically Amalek, which is a term that's used by the Zionists sort of to justify the destruction of the Palestinian people. So I'd be
Amalek is
happy
the
to hear that.
eternal enemy. And so that's just their archetypical enemy. But they have plenty. They have plenty of others as well. But why don't I talk about Baal? Because that is interesting because in the scholarly literature, Baal basically Yahweh took Baal's place. Baal was a storm god, but I write about it. He was his storms were like the gentle storms that produced agriculture. Because remember, we're talking about a semi-desert area
Of
here,
course.
uh,
Yeah.
highly arid, and so Baal's storms gave life. And so there's a lot of mythology, Canaanite mythology around Baal. He did descend into hell at some point. There's a story about his sister bringing him into hell, and then he basically gets a pass half the year, and that's kind of the rainy season. So you could why everyone thinks he's some demon. I have no understanding of. He was basically Yahweh took his place. He took over for him. There
Interesting.
was another conflation. I didn't really want to get into that because the article was so long.
Very interesting.
But
Okay.
but yes, so there's no I don't know. I'm sure a true believer would could explain why Baal is so demonic, but none of those gods are very clean from back in the day.
I
So
see. I see.
um,
So why don't you
yeah.
go through a little bit what are the thrust of your arguments here at the end of this article and the second part of this argument of this article?
Okay, well, I'll try to go quickly through it. That when with the Canaanite pantheon theory, we start with a pantheon, a four-level, what I call bureaucracy, with El and his wife at the top. El is the most high. El's name still is like Israel is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
uh, some one interpretation is he who struggles with God, something, but and so the structure was he had 60 sons. They had 60 sons. 60 is just the word for many. It might be 70.
You mean
I didn't,
the Hebrew word for 60 is the same as for many or what?
I'm just, my brain is telling me it's actually 70.
Okay.
But, it's like a symbolic number for meaning many. So there were 70, I believe, nations. But obviously, in the UN, we have 200 nations. And so it was just like a symbolic number. And I don't think it's necessarily Hebrew, actually. It was Canaanite. And so, but they adopted a lot of that. And so there were 70 sons. Um, and Yahweh was just one son, and he was given the what we call Israel now. And so, but there were plenty of other gods that were given other land. And
So how
so it
was
was like a,
so how was Israel defined then? Do we have an idea of the area that was
yeah,
defined as
actually, I
Israel?
was preparing another article on that. Yes, there are conflicting maps in the Bible because like God, you always hear among Zionists, God promised us, Israel. So I was always curious, it's like, what exactly did He
Exactly.
promise?
Because of
And
course, this is very relevant with today's you know Israeli politics, where on the one
okay,
hand, Israel has no defined borders, right? This is very unusual for a country, for a nation. And secondly, there's constantly this talk, and more than talk, of the greater Israel, which is much larger than the current borders of Israel today.
yes, I studied it quite a bit. I was preparing an article, so it's exactly that. I want to know what is Greater Israel? What is the history? What is the biblical background of it? And so, um, as everything with the Bible, there's lots of contradictions, and there's like three or four places where they talk about what Israel is. And obviously, it's not so easy to know when they say the Great River. Often people think it's the Nile, but other scholars say no, it's not the Nile, it's something different. And so it's definitely going into Lebanon much more than the current Israel, which is maybe why they're pushing so hard into Lebanon. But uh, but yes, it's a very interesting question. And so, but actually, I think if we go down, actually, oh, there's a map. Yours is on the screen. There's a map that shows where Moab and some of the so they were constantly warring. The structure there was you had El and Ashura, his wife, consort, they say, and then you had the 70 sons who often were like battling with each other. And so,
You
uh,
have an area here called Edom, which is basically an
yes,
area between the Dead Sea and the Red Sea, as I see it.
yeah, which is that even today, that's part of Israel, but that wasn't then. Seir is important. So maybe I should roll back a little bit because actually Freud talked about this too. Yahweh is really from Saudi Arabia. So from a volcanic region in very northern Saudi Arabia. It's not on this map. I was trying. It's just a little bit further down. It actually, I think it says somewhere Midian to Midian. So uh, and in the Bible, Moses was in Midian, and so what Freud argues is Yahweh was a volcano god from Midian. He came up through maybe smiths, ironworkers, who settled in Israel. Obviously, super speculative. We can't. But anyway, so he went north in very early in the Bible. They have this scene where they're given the, I think it's what I call the divine bureaucracy, where they're given each the sons is given some land. Then they go, they fight wars or whatever. Whenever the funny thing is what I call divine narcissism. Whenever a god loses, they always say, "Well, actually, I didn't lose. I did it on purpose because I'm mad at my people because they were sinning and they weren't doing the right sacrifices." And so
But you
you can
recognize a
see,
little bit of this also in the Greek pantheon, the way the Greek gods
yes,
also used to behave, right?
exactly, exactly. And so you can't because if a god just says, "Yeah, I'm weak. I lost," they're going to give him up. So we always had to come up with different excuses. And so what happened is Israel lost a lot. They lost a lot of wars back then. And in fact, the big catastrophe was Babylonia invaded Jerusalem and crushed the first temple and then took some of the elite into exile in Babylon. And so at that point, they had a crisis because gods were linked to territory. Uh, and but once they were no longer in their territory, they had to come up with a new regime. And so that's when they started making Yahweh the universal God. He was he was basically replacing El. And so there's this great scene in the Bible later on where they have another divine council, and now running it is Yahweh, not El, and he strips all the other gods of their powers.
I
He
see.
makes them mortal,
Okay, so
and at
this is
that
the
point,
way,
Yahweh is the one
is
and
it,
only God.
so this is the way that the Israeli religion went from polytheism to monotheism, right?
Yes, there's a great quote from Freud saying that for me, just to back up a little, whenever I think of monotheism and polytheism, I'm thinking unipolar world, multipolar world. I'm thinking these are kind of symbolic archetypes of these two organizational models. And so what Freud was saying is you could understand Egyptian monotheism because they were an empire and they wanted to impose their god on everyone. Whereas he was saying with Israel, they were just a tiny little country. Why would they want to have the universal God? And this is where we come back. So why would this little country conflate themselves with the universal? And that's where we come back to the point of the article is this National Defense Authorization Act, where legally Israeli interests get conflated with America, with the great, powerful America, little tiny Israel. And it's very similar symbolically to the way Yahweh took over from El.
Very
Well,
interesting.
it hasn't
Very,
taken
very
over yet,
interesting.
but you know,
I
it's
like
it's
this
a
kind of
process.
I like these kind of connections between current politics and, in a way, the politics of the past, because it's not only mythology. There are often, references to real events, even though we don't know exactly these real events. But to get back just very quickly before I let you continue about this aspect of monotheism, it's very interesting that the first commandment, right, of the Decalogue is, I am your God. Thou shalt not have any other gods besides me. And of course, if the Israeli Jewish culture or religion was a purely monotheistic religion, then you wouldn't have any need for this first commandment, right? The first commandment exists
Exactly.
in precisely in order to state that for all of you who have not yet completely put your faith only in Yahweh, remember that Yahweh is the only God, right? So it sort of hints at the fact that Israel was a land of polytheism as well, just like all the other cultures of that time.
Yeah, it's only natural, but yes, there's lots of clues within the Bible of the polytheistic past, and so a lot of these channels go through them and discuss them and the different interpretations. Oh,
Okay.
obviously, the other side always has a way of explaining it away that it's no, 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 it doesn't mean that. But
So,
so
so why don't we come now to a little bit the conclusion of your article, what you are driving at towards the end here?
yeah, so basically, what to me, I think we're almost at the late stage say that we're going to a reversal back towards a polytheistic world order. And that this is a last desperate effort by the United States and Israel to hold on to this unipolar kind of idea. But as we see across in Ukraine, in against Iran, against China, just in general, that this system is just not sustainable, and that we're falling back towards something more like the divine council, where each nation has sovereignty. So each nation had their god, basically. It kind of made them sovereign, whereas in a monotheistic world, there's only one God. It's the U.S. plus Israel, and they make the decisions. And so you see it's a fragmentation of ultimate power, a move as from our a move from transcendence towards immanence from our earlier discussions. And
Interesting.
so,
Interesting. So I recommend everybody to read this article. It's extremely interesting and it connects, of course, the present, a very sensitive and traumatic, actually, geopolitical events that we're living through right now with equally traumatic events around the birth of Israel. And of course, these events a long time ago took place over maybe centuries, right? But nevertheless, I think it's very interesting this kind of connection that you're making. So, anything else you want to add before we close?
no, I think we covered it well.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot, Kevin, and let's talk
Thank you,
again
Ben.
soon.
Yes, let's do it.